Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and this is the Current Podcast.
The federal government waited less than 24 hours to intervene after CN and CKPC locked out workers late last week. And over the weekend, the Canadian Industrial Relations Board ordered them back to work and set out a timeline for binding arbitration. Both companies were forced to resume operations today at 1 minute past midnight.
The reality of it is pretty much everything we use goes on a train at some point. So for us, the important thing is to be able to refocus our energies where they are best spent, which is on getting the economy moving again.
Jonathan Abacassis from CN Rail says the company is, quote, satisfied that this ends the labour conflict. But the Teamsters Union, representing workers with both companies, says this isn't over, and it pledges to file a court appeal. So the issue still looms large for the Trudeau cabinet as it meets at its annual post-summer retreat in Halifax today. After a bruising by-election loss earlier this summer, the government heads into the fall session of Parliament hoping for a bit of a reset. And here to talk about all of this is our National Affairs panel. Catherine Cullen is the host of CBC Radio's The House. And this week, she's also hosting Power in Politics. Stephanie Levitz is the Deputy Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star. And Ryan Tumilty is a parliamentary reporter for the National Post. Good morning, you three.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Catherine, starting with you, what will be the political fallout for the Liberals and how they handled this railway labour dispute?
Susan, you can just feel the great pains the Liberals are taking to not have this damage their relationship with unions. You half expect the new Labour Minister to show up with like an I Heart Unions t-shirt in Halifax or something like that. For somebody who has shut down the collective bargaining process, he has talked again and again about how much the government appreciates collective bargaining. They really are trying not to lose that support here, despite this move to shut down the negotiations. Really, the Liberals had to pick their poison here. The economic pain was potentially massive if they had allowed this to go on. Just yesterday, Stephen McKinnon, the new Labour Minister, talked about having to prevent economic carnage. Now, they didn't want to alienate workers by shutting down these talks, but at the same time, the risk to the economy was for such general pain for Canadians as a whole that this is the route they've chosen. But they know both the NDP and the Conservatives are going after the very same votes of workers, and you can kind of feel their anxiety as they try to move this situation forward.
Indeed. Ryan, what's your assessment? Why do you think the government intervened when it did?
It was too much economic damage. Economic carnage is not an overstatement of the impact of that the strike would have had. You're talking about $1 billion in trade every day. For grain farmers, it would have amounted to losses of $50 million a day, right at the worst possible time. I think what you're seeing here is the difference between having to govern and being in opposition. It is a comfortable position for the NDP to criticize the government. It is sticking with their long-held values. This is what an NDP party is supposed to do. And the Conservatives had nothing to say on this issue, interestingly. They became mute last week over this issue. And that's something that you can do in opposition, but you can't do in government. The Liberals had to act here. They had to do something. I think you're seeing the Labour Minister try to patch over that hole, but I don't think he really had a choice.
Stephanie, how much political pressure is there on the Liberals still to get this sorted out? I mean, we've heard there will be a court action.
Yeah, to pick up on my colleague's smart points there, the other political pressure coming is from the Conservatives, mute as they may have been on this subject. All of their narrative, all of their pitch to voters right now is about the Liberal government being unable to manage the economy and everything they do, creating misery and pain and danger for Canadians. And while the Conservative argument might be filled with a bunch of hyperbole from time to time, on this particular issue, it wouldn't have been. As Ryan, pointed out, the potential here for significant economic damage was very, very real. And not only do the Liberals, of course, not want that for Canadians, we can believe that to be true. They actually do not want that for the economy. The political damage that would have come alongside that would have been very real for them.
Indeed. Catherine, let's pivot a bit to talk about this cabinet retreat underway in Halifax. What's your sense of the mood in cabinet, particularly when we're talking about Justin Trudeau's leadership?
Well, what I have heard is that the Prime Minister himself has actually been, in all things considered, a pretty good mood this summer. But there's no question this is an uphill battle. I know there are a lot of theories out there from pundits, from Liberal MPs whose names aren't being reported, but who are being quoted in news articles who are saying, try a cabinet shuffle, try a new policy, try some contrition. I don't have any sense that there is a cabinet shuffle coming. The people around Justin Trudeau say that that is not the case. And they did try this whole fresh coat of paint look last summer. You only need to cast your mind back to the last summer cabinet retreat in PEI. There had just been that significant cabinet shuffle, putting Sean Fraser in the housing portfolio. The Liberals kept saying they were really going to lean in on housing. It was the housing cabinet retreat. This is around the time that the Liberals started seeing their numbers going down and down. There were a lot of questions about, okay, you're talking a big game on housing, but people are feeling the pain right now. Where is the action? They struggled to show the payoff. Now, all this time later, they did put out a significant housing policy in the spring to coincide with the budget, basically everything, including the kitchen sink, to try to deal with this crisis. My sense is that they're really just trying to lean in on the game plan that they've set out for themselves. But this idea of really like trying to turn over a new leaf, it's not clear to me that they see a tool that can do that for them.
Stephanie, a lot of Canadians have been tuned into the drama south of us and have seen the U.S. Democratic Party, of course, pivot to Kamala Harris. Do you think that Liberals are looking at that and thinking about how it might apply to Trudeau's leadership?
Yeah, they have to be, right? I mean, the echo of American politics is always felt on the Canadian political landscape. And there's a bunch of different ways to look at what is going on with the Democratic Party. One of them is, the messaging and the energy and the enthusiasm that is right now being vested in Kamala Harris. Can the Liberals recapture that under Justin Trudeau? And if they can't, then what? We've already seen the Liberals borrowing some of the tactics of the Democratic Party to sort of go after Conservative Leader Pierre Poilievre. But of course, when they're looking at it, what had been a moribund Democratic Party in the U.S. who switched leaders at the last minute and seemed to have now at least been on a little bit of an upswing, it can't be hard to look at that and go, well, if it works for them, couldn't it work for us too?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have that as a back of the mind question. Ryan, turning to the economy again, though, the inflation rate dropped in July to 2.5%, the lowest since 2021. But we all know the cost of living is still looming large for the Liberals. So how large as this cabinet meets this week?
I think it's central. You talk to Liberals and there's a realization, I think, that until Canadians feel better about the economy and their cost of living issues, that those poll numbers aren't moving. I don't think you can do really anything as a government. If people aren't feeling good about the economy, they're going to vote you out. And so I think that's continuing, and that has to be central for them. I think there's an acknowledgement that things are headed in the right direction. A couple of good months, more than a few months of good inflation numbers and 2 interest rate cuts are helpful to the Canadian economy. But we did still go through 8 and 9 and 10% inflation for months on end. So, when you're going to the grocery store and you're hearkening back to 3 years ago or 4 years ago, you're still thinking about how much more it costs you, even if, that rate of growth is slowing down. It's still costing you a lot more than it used to.
Indeed, and they have to change that perception. Who was jumping in there? Anyway, we'll move on then to Pierre Poilievre. People have been enjoying their summer, we hope, not tracking his every move. We talked about how the Conservative Party was a bit mute on the rail strike. Catherine, what has Poilievre been doing this summer?
Susan, he's been enjoying the great Canadian tradition of road trip to some of Canada's most beautiful swing ridings. He really has seen so much of the country. Started off the summer in Quebec, including touring the province in an RV with his family. He's returned to Quebec throughout the summer. He was there just last week. Why? Because a Conservative breakthrough in Quebec would be really significant for the Conservatives if they do indeed want to form a majority government. He's been to BC. He's been to Northern Ontario. He's been to the Greater Toronto area. The Conservatives really want to pick up seats in Eastern Canada. Been to all 4 Atlantic provinces. He is doggedly focused on his message that basically what ails Canada. It is all, as Steph was saying earlier, Justin Trudeau's fault, and that Pierre Poilievre says he's going to fix it. To give you a sense of the tone that he is bringing into all of this, a note yesterday from the Conservatives went out to media. The subject line was Trudeau's housing hell. It described Trudeau's cabinet meeting in Halifax and said they will discuss, these are the cabinet ministers, ways to make life more costly and miserable for Canadians. So Pierre Poilievre has been banging on that drum all summer. I think we can expect that banging to continue as Parliament is set to resume in a few weeks.
On the offensive, it sounds like. Stephanie, I want to turn back the clock a bit, though, and ask you about a video that the Conservative Party put out last week and then quickly deleted. Let's hear a bit of that.
And it's easy to forget what home and hope look like. So let me paint the picture of school children, boys and girls, being welcomed by their teacher at the front of the school as they walk in to learn about reading, writing, arithmetic, and our proud history. Before walking in the door, though, they look back at Dad in his pickup truck who's dropped them off.
Stephanie, what was the problem with that video?
The problem with the video was the images that went along or underneath, I guess, on top of Pierre Poilievre's speech. But the speech itself was a bit of a stock speech he tends to give at his rallies now, where he lays out his vision of Canada. And then what had happened was the communications team at the party had decided to use that and put some stock footage over it to illustrate his point, except the stock footage was largely not Canadian whatsoever. And so it was a bit of a misstep, let's say, I'm perhaps putting it mildly, for a party that has built such an enormous prowess online that really lives and thrives in the social media ecosystem. To make a rookie mistake like this was rather embarrassing.
Ryan, do gaffes like that one end up having any real effect? I mean, polls show Poilievre is out in front right now.
No, I don't think so. It's a mistake, and it's uncharacteristic of the party, I would say. They are usually much better at this sort of thing. It's the kind of mistake that Pierre Poilievre has avoided, throughout his time as leader. He has really run a strong campaign, and he's worked aggressively. We talk about all the places he's gone to this summer. I think even his staff will tell you the man doesn't stop. And he's not going to be outworked in the push in this election race. So that is something that I think the Liberals have to think about. But yeah, I don't think when voters go to the polls in those by-elections, they'll say, I like that Poilievre fellow, but the video where he had U.S. images, I'm changing my vote.
Right. Steph mentioned the echo of U.S. politics, and Catherine, I want to ask you about something else about that. The Liberals have borrowed from the Democrats a bit, attacking Poilievre and the Conservatives as, quote, weird, which we heard in the U.S. in the last few weeks. Is that effective when the Liberals try to draw those parallels between Trump and the Conservatives?
I do think there are certainly some in the Liberal camp who believe that it is. The weird thing in particular, I don't get the sense that that was some coordinated strategy. I think it was some Liberal MPs sort of throwing spaghetti at the wall, hoping something would stick. Because one thing about the Liberals is the MPs in particular, many of them have been hungry for a long time for their party to mount a meaningful attack against Pierre Poilievre, and they do not feel that that has happened. I think that they feel that perhaps there has been an improvement in the last several months, but that still a lot more needs to be done to counter Poilievre's, as we were talking about earlier, sort of unending stream of attacks against them. The Prime Minister does seem to enjoy calling Pierre Poilievre's team, MAGA conservatives. The Liberals, I think, more than anything, certainly around Justin Trudeau, are hoping that perhaps some of the enthusiasm around Kamala Harris, insofar as it is about progressive politics, so the same kinds of ideals that they see themselves as espousing, that there might be a little bit of a bleed over on that front. Some of them do hope that there will also be bleed on the Donald Trump side of things. I'm not sure whether polling numbers suggest that that is indeed the case, that people are that concerned that, for instance, Pierre Poilievre just wouldn't be able to stand up to Donald Trump. There's polling that suggests otherwise. But there are certainly some in the Liberal camp that hope that that might be part of a path towards the Liberals building themselves back up.
Stephanie, digging a little deeper in Canada-U.S. relations, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan popped up in Halifax yesterday at the retreat. How much work is trying to go on is in Halifax for the relationship between the U.S. and Canada and preparing for whatever happens in November?
I mean, the surprise visit from Jake Sullivan was pretty interesting. In what world is the White House, national security advisor thinking, I'll just take a little jaunt over to Halifax, see how the Trudeau Liberals are holding up? There's got to be more to that than meets the eye at this moment. But it is clear from the Trudeau Liberals' perspective that they are trying to prepare for whatever the outcome is with the U.S. presidential election. They're trying this, renewed Team Canada approach that they used under the Trump administration to build relationships and cross-border communication, keep those lines open so that no matter who's in the White House, Canada will be able to have some kind of voice as that new president seeks to craft international policies, right? I mean, Canada, the trade relationship between the two countries alone, think about this railway stoppage, right? I mean, it was of such concern to the White House that they convened their own special internal panel to try and figure out what this meant for their economy. And I think Canadians are always mindful of that, and building relationships matters in the longer term.
Yeah, it's really hard to plan on two tracks, I'm sure, not knowing what's going to happen, of course, in November. Ryan, we mentioned by-elections coming up in September. Back in June, the Liberals suffered a surprise in what was previously a pretty safe Toronto riding. What should we be looking at in those other two by-elections?
Yeah, I think there's two stories there, very much. The one in Montreal, in LaSalle, is another test for the Trudeau Liberals. That is a safe Liberal seat. It should be just as safe as Toronto St. Paul's was. So if they lose that is certainly a big question for the Liberals, especially because we are talking now about a riding in the Liberals' backyard. And one of the, selling points of Trudeau as Prime Minister politically has always been that he can shore up that support in Quebec. The other riding that I think is almost more interesting is in Winnipeg, Elmwood, Transcona. It is an NDP riding. It has been an NDP riding almost uninterrupted for the last 40 years. The only time the Conservatives have won it is 2011, when, of course, they won a majority government. So that is one to watch, because there are a lot of ridings like it across the country. There are a lot of ridings that aren't Liberal NDP races or Liberal Conservative races. They are Conservative NDP races with the Liberals a distant third. And so, if the Conservatives win that riding, a bunch of other ones are potentially in play that the Liberals can't do anything about.
Catherine, we've got about a minute left here. What is your descriptor for the next few months in Canadian politics? How would you assess that?
I'm tempted to say dynamic in the sense that I think that there is going to be a lot to watch, but I'm not convinced. I think dynamic also suggests that perhaps some of the public opinion is going to move. And I think really that is less clear. The primary challenge, we talked about the economy and how people are feeling, this idea of a me session, that even if the numbers are changing, people don't feel that their own circumstances are getting better. So that's a huge challenge for the Liberals. But on top of that, the fact of the matter is, it's almost 9 years they've been governing now, and there is just a fatigue with them. And so it's going to take a lot, I think, to turn things around. So what do Justin Trudeau and his team have in their bag of tricks? What is it? Is it just putting your nose to the grindstone? Can that really make a difference when it feels like that this fatigue has really set in with a lot of Canadians? I think those are going to be the things to watch, and more tests for Pierre Poilievre. He is very clearly a front runner right now. How is he going to respond to some of these difficult circumstances? Steph talked about him being relatively mute in the face of the rail situation. Let's see what the world has to offer in the next few months.
It's going to be interesting on both sides of the border. Thank you very much. Catherine Cullen is the host of CBC's Radio The House. Stephanie Levitz is the Deputy Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star. And Ryan Tumilty is a parliamentary reporter for the National Post.